Hello and welcome to the Reorg, where we dive into the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute archives and re-examine old ideas after years of accumulated proof of work. This is your host, Michael Goldstein, also known as Bitstein, and joining me as always is my co-host, Pierre Rochard. Pierre, welcome.
Thanks for having us back. Looking forward to this one.
Yeah, well, we've been really working our way through the S&I mempool crash course. So I think this is maybe episode 16. So we've been getting through quite a bit. We've gone through, the monetary policy, the kind of initial value of Bitcoin and sort of the fundamentals, why Bitcoin grows and why that's not a bubble, the benefits of hoarding and how hoarding establishes the value and sort of acts as the foundational value of the Bitcoin network. And then we went through altcoins and the issue with altcoins and the altcoin narratives. And we also talked about volatility, which is a very common argument. And today we're getting into a different argument about Bitcoin that we've been dealing with in many different ways for basically since the beginning of Bitcoin, and that has to do with the so-called image problem of Bitcoin. People thinking that it has the incorrect optics or something of the sort. So today we're talking about Bitcoin Has No Image Problem by Daniel Krawisz. This came out in February 25th, 2014. The price was about $534. And yeah, people at the time were very upset about illicit usage of Bitcoin, which we've certainly heard about since then as well in many forms, which we'll get into. And this is trying to look at Bitcoin from a different angle so as to not let these types of uses of Bitcoin blind us from the real value that Bitcoin offers us.
I want to add to, I remember Satoshi himself being concerned about the use of Bitcoin with WikiLeaks.
Yes,
and
yes.
saying Bitcoin's not ready for that kind of attention and heat. So it's really interesting that, maybe his concerns were more realistic. I don't know. We can talk about that, but it's not like it's been a minority view.
Yes, that's a good point about that quote. So that was in 2010. So very, very early on, Bitcoin barely even had a price. So basically most of 2009, there was no price. And it was only getting into 2010 that we started to see a price develop. And so it was very early on. WikiLeaks was obviously in global news, and they were having their own various forms of deplatforming and banking troubles for doing the journalism that they were doing. And they started accepting Bitcoin, and Satoshi said something along the lines of being concerned that it would kick the hornet's nest. And yeah, so that was a big thing, and hopefully we can get more into that shortly. So, like I said, this article was February 25th, 2014. To set the stage, this is in a footnote later, but Mt. Gox was going to be collapsing, I want to say about a month and a half after this article came out. Which itself was a massive event in Bitcoin. And I think that'll be worth bringing up as well. So a lot of historical context here, and so the article will also get into that. So for listeners, that's something to consider with this one is the historical context. And we'll also have a lot to say about the historical context since then, because this is something that just simply has not gone away, but it's taken many, many forms. So, starting out, why doesn't Bitcoin's success speak for itself? Bitcoin has an image problem. Everyone thinks Bitcoin is for drug dealers, hackers, and anarchists. It's used to gamble and buy porn. People think it's a Ponzi scheme. Bitcoin needs to grow up and repudiate its youthful indiscretions. Its services must be run by professionals, not amateurs. Soccer moms will never use Bitcoin if they think it's used for drugs and porn. Bitcoin will never be acceptable and gain widespread adoption otherwise. In this article, I will show why the above paragraph is totally misguided. Bitcoin is far too useful to expect that prejudice will stand in its way. Almost everyone who has ever bought Bitcoins had to overcome an initial skepticism, and this will continue to be the case right until Bitcoin takes over. To want Bitcoins requires a person who can see ahead a little bit better than everyone else. The only way to convince most of them that Bitcoin is in their future is to build that future and show it to them. Those with a less entrepreneurial mindset will simply have to be in much worse financial straits without it. Those with a less entrepreneurial mindset will simply have to be in much worse financial straits without it before they will be ready to adopt. The data on Bitcoin's adoption rate shows no evidence of an image problem. First, look at this log chart of Bitcoin's market cap. And for anyone who's ever seen a log chart of Bitcoin's market cap, it's basically the same thing no matter the time frame you look at it. It's up and to the right with a bunch of little ups and downs. And that's what we saw in this one, going from basically mid 2010 to early 2014 when this article came out. And then now take a look at the number of My Wallet users over the past 2 years. This is also a log chart. And this was an online wallet, very popular back then. And, I'm sure people would probably cringe at this now, as they probably should. It was very common to have various web wallets where you were using some kind of client key to secure everything, but you were using a web interface with a server that actually held the data, but encryption and everything might be happening in the browser. And My Wallet, I don't remember that one in particular, but I assume it was basically one of those, similar to blockchain.info and a few others of the sort. And the chart is a more smoothed out up and to the right log chart. That's an increase of like 500 times in 2 years. Ooh, I'm so terrified Bitcoin's image will stop people from wanting it. And what about BitPay, Bitcoin's premier payment processor? In September of 2013, they signed up their 10,000th merchant. By December, they had over 14,000. On Black Friday of 2012, they processed 99 payments. That same day of 2013, they processed 6,296. Are you kidding me? I've never seen anyone want anything this badly. People can't get enough Bitcoins. Every indication of Bitcoin's adoption shows a rapid exponential growth. The idea that Bitcoin has an image problem is empirically ridiculous. You could run an ad campaign for Bitcoin that tells people it's the stupidest idea ever and punch people in the face when they bought in, and they would still flock to Bitcoin. You know how I know that? Because that's basically what has been happening since the beginning of the Bitcoin economy. Noobs enter the Bitcoin world to find scams and sophomoric novices that give them terrible advice. They lose their investment from simple mistakes, and they get raped by the markets. They are serious problems. These are serious problems that need to be ameliorated. But the point is that people can have very bad experiences when they enter the Bitcoin world, and they still want more Bitcoin. This is how we know we don't have to worry about Bitcoin's image. I would add to that not only do you enter the Bitcoin world and get surrounded by various scammers and people who have advice that might end up losing you your coins, or various investment opportunities that are also great ways to lose your coins. You also have the outside world. So that's in the in-group of Bitcoiners. You have a big problem of people within that world who can lead people astray. But you go to the out-group, and the out-group is typically, they're either not too knowledgeable about Bitcoin in a sort of explicit way where it's just indifference, shall we say, or they're just hating on Bitcoin. And so you get into Bitcoin and you have the world telling you just how stupid you are. And that, for some people, that can be quite the emotional struggle. And it's also, quite a test of conviction to be able to think through that. So I would add that as well. But when I think of this, I think of the Galileo quote, "Eper se muove," and yet it moves. So people have all of these ideas about all the things that are going to cause Bitcoin to fail. In this case, dealing with things that are maybe not a good look in their opinion. People are using Bitcoin in a way that they personally do not approve of, rightly or wrongly. There's some things that, I certainly am not excited about in the marketplace, but people use that as an attack on Bitcoin itself, the way that you'd get mad at people sending emails dealing with political things you don't like as being an attack on SMTP. I think of Galileo, and it's, despite your feelings about this, the empirical data shows that the value of Bitcoin increases. And so perhaps if the marketing was better and more tailored to the right people at the right time, maybe the line would have a steeper curve up and to the right. But we can't say that it has really hindered Bitcoin's growth to the point of not being able to just constantly go up and to the right over the sort of long-term trends.
Yeah, and I'd also add that part of what makes Bitcoin authentic and grassroots and real is that it doesn't have that polish, right? It doesn't have the public relations, the publicists, the designers, with all due respect to all the great Bitcoin designers out there now, that when, we opened up the software back in 2013 or whatever, it didn't have it had the open source vibe, and I think that actually spoke to the fact that it was transparent and you didn't have to worry about, like, contrast that with Ripple, okay, where it was always very polished and very marketing corporate speak. So I think that there's the grittiness to it means that, okay, this is real. It's not just somebody trying to shill something to me.
Yes. I think also, in this historical time, so to give people an idea, there was starting to be a feeling like, okay, Bitcoin is real and it should start entering the banking system, and we want banks to be into it. And there were certain entities, the way that they viewed that occurring was not through going to the banks and saying, hey, here's this infrastructure, here's why it's like good for you. It was let's point the guns at the Bitcoiners and try to tell them that they shouldn't have various libertarian beliefs and so on and so forth. They sort of wanted to bend the knee to the banks, as opposed to going to the banks and explaining why the banks should bend the knee to Bitcoin. And this was very much part of that image discussion. So it's like, Bitcoin early on, it's very libertarian, but we don't have to look at it like that. We can look at it these other ways. And, perhaps you can, but it's, maybe there's something to be said about the fact that Bitcoin can come out, very authentically, as you're saying. It comes out with nothing. It's very rough around the edges. There is nothing. It's just like even the code base is, perhaps not engineered in the way that we would have engineered a project if we knew what Bitcoin would be later on. And I think this actually is a cause of a lot of issues that go on as far as drama in the Bitcoin development world, kind of follows from that historical contingency. And despite that, You have very libertarian-minded people who tend to be, you have a lot more technical people within that cohort. You have a lot more people who have strong beliefs about the financial system. Why is it that those people are the ones who were best capable of seeing Bitcoin into the future where it is today, where a lot of those same banks we're now seeing, like they do have a growing interest in Bitcoin. So instead of like trying to suppress those people and their ideas, we should, instead kind of think, what can we learn from them? Maybe they're not 100% correct. Maybe they are, but what of their set of ideas can we learn from, because it did allow them to see that this was a real and exciting thing, even when others could completely dismiss it for all sorts of various reasons.
Yeah, and I think that there's also like cognitive biases, and we talked about this with the altcoins of the motivated reasoning. There's motivated reasoning on the skeptic side of trying to figure out arguments against Bitcoin. And so it starts with they don't like Bitcoin, they don't want Bitcoin. So then they try to find ways to rationalize, and a lot of them are very smart, and so they do find lots of arguments like this. But it ends up just being concern trolling, because it's not the arguments they come up with. Even if they're true, right? Like obviously it's bad if terrorists use Bitcoin and it makes it look bad. It's not a decisive factor. And so it's like, okay, well, that can be true and Bitcoin can succeed.
Right. So let's continue on that thread. Bitcoin's image is actually great. I think Bitcoin has a great image, and that Bitcoin's association with illicit activity should not be seen as a problem for it. I can't think of any better way to generate interest in Bitcoin than drug dealing, hackers, and anarchy. When was the last time you heard someone say, "Oh, Bitcoin? I've heard of that. That's that new currency that's great for remittances, right?" Never. That's when. Drug dealing, hackers, and anarchy are great lead-ins to a conversation. I remember the days when Bitcoin was so unknown that I was not even recognized as a dork for talking about it. In those days, nobody wanted to hear about Bitcoin, not even libertarians. If I tried to talk about it, it was like people didn't even hear me. Now everyone wants to hear about it, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Furthermore, Bitcoin's improvements to the illegal drug industry and to practical anarchism have been one of its greatest successes, so why shouldn't people associate Bitcoin with drug dealers and anarchists? Not only is that honest, but it is a strong endorsement. If Bitcoin is good for illicit activity, that means it empowers people. If people think that Bitcoin can help them to evade contraband laws, to taste the forbidden fruit, to satisfy needs that society would rather have them suppressed, then that is a fantastic advertisement. Bitcoin is subversive as more than just a payment processing technology. It is not just a cool new gadget that ordinary people can use without fearing that it will lead them unexpected new directions that test their ability to grow as a person. It has the potential to change their lives irrevocably. It has the potential to drastically change the balance of power in society. It is perfectly reasonable for people to be suspicious. People should feel a real twinge of danger when they first get Bitcoins. It can usher them into realms which their society has long told them were off limits. If we got people to believe that Bitcoin was only good for revolutionizing e-commerce, then Bitcoin would have an image problem, because that would not be honest. So this is one, I think there's good and bad to this take, I think. But the first thing that I want to get into with the historical context, because I think that matters when we're talking about this point. So as we said before, this article was written February 25th, 2014. So this was about, call it, for almost 5 months after the takedown of the Silk Road. And I wanted to share some charts for the people who are watching, and I'll describe them for the people who are just listening. But here we have a chart. So this is on October 1st or so was when the Silk Road got taken down. Based on this, I think this is UTC. So I think it may have been technically October 2nd. It was early October that this happened. So I don't know if the UTC here I don't know where it aligns on it, but you can see exactly when the news broke out that the FBI had seized the Silk Road. Ross Ulbricht had been arrested in San Francisco, and the price crashed practically immediately from about $125 down to around $85. And then over the next few hours, it pops back up to 110, and it kind of, had a little bit of volatility, but growth over the next few days. And 3 days later, it was back above 120. So it was a little less than it had been, very like a few dollars, but it basically got back to where it was in just a few days. And the next chart is looking at the price as a whole. So this is covering, from Bitcoin's beginning up through the day of the article. And what we see is, in 2013, we had the kind of early 2013 rally around, March and April that went up to $200. And then later on, it kind of had volatility. It went down to, I guess, like in the 60s, and then made its way back up to 125. And then that's when this happened on October 2nd. We see the price went down and then back up. And then not too long after that, by the end of the month, we were already on our way up a incredible rally all the way up into November, beginning of November. And by the end of November, it was $1,100. And at the time of writing, it was after this peak and things were kind of doing the usual hype cycle where kind of it goes down and it goes up a little bit and keeps going down before it finds the new level. And this article was being written during that sort of price discovery after the peak. The point of this being is if you are looking at this graph, I would have to tell you where that little blip happened. It's down here. I'm moving my mouse around it for those who are watching, but it's right before this big thing, and it's actually, it's steeper, but it's actually less imposing on the eyes than the sort of crash in July of 2013, a few months prior. It is basically irrelevant in many ways. And then if we look at the log chart of it, we can see a little more, but still, it's kind of just, it looks like just a regular day in Bitcoin from the chart point of view. And then we go to the all-time graph. So we look into from the beginning to today as of recording. And once again, like a listener would or a viewer would probably need my help finding where this was. And I'll point out where it was right here. It's just this tiny little blip. This is the log chart. It's a tiny little blip on the price of Bitcoin over time. On the log chart, on the linear chart, it's invisible because all of 2012 and 2013 is invisible relative to what it is today. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that by February 2014, I think it was already safe to say that honestly, drug dealing, is not even a real part of the Bitcoin image. In fact, to many people who are, not into drugs and just want Bitcoin for good savings, there was somewhat of a relief in the sense of this got to help show that the Silk Road was a notable but not a highly impactful part of the Bitcoin economy. It's certainly like a very interesting one historically. There's much to say about it, but in terms of the macro, which is, what would matter to just sort of anyone who's interested, do I want this money? Do I not want this money? The Silk Road was really not a big part of that macro story. Perhaps we could talk, at a different time about the sort of micro effects of the Silk Road. But this kind of showed, even then, drug dealing was, and drugs on Bitcoin, it really was more of a hook to talking about it of like, yeah, people were using it for that, than it was the reality of the Bitcoin macro environment.
Yeah, and it's, with all due respect to Silk Road and Ross Ulbricht, I hear people say things like, oh, without the Silk Road, we wouldn't have known that you can actually transact with Bitcoin. And it's like, well, you can literally send a transaction to yourself and you can see that you can transact with Bitcoin. You don't need a marketplace for that. And that, arguably, look, hindsight is always 2020. Everything happens for a reason, but maybe it would have been better for everyone if Ross Ulbricht had been on the outside for the past 10 years and that there had been no Silk Road. I think that we would all figured Bitcoin out, without it, but it's not like I think that sometimes it gets excessively glamorized or positioned as Bitcoin could never have evolved or existed without it.
Yes, I think there's a need to detach someone's personal history of how they came to learn about different features of Bitcoin versus believing that that was the cosmic necessity, so to speak. So I can say, in many ways, I do think that the Silk Road was inspiring for me because it acted as a sort of reductio ad absurdum, or in art of the deal terms, it was almost like anchoring. It's like showing, yes, you can obviously transact with Bitcoin. This kind of just gave a glimpse of like, there is a permissionless nature to it, and people are acting out. Now, there's also the consequences, but it was showing that. And I think that's actually part of what is interesting here about this as like a so-called image problem is when we're talking about something like drug dealing, that's something that I think even a lot of libertarians don't want in their personal, libertarian society, like, the sphere that they actually live in. They don't necessarily want any drugs around. They don't want the state creating a war on drugs and putting people in jail for certain kinds of drug-related crimes, and don't even want to necessarily call them crimes by legal terms, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily have a morality that says, oh, so therefore we should just have as many drugs around me as possible. It can be quite the opposite, where it's like you don't want the state bringing the hammer down in a way that in many ways works against the problem of trying to keep drugs away from people. But you do want, they don't want to raise their kids around, people using drugs. So that being said, when you can see that things are possible there, it sort of just for people, it evokes an image in their mind that Bitcoin is capable of doing things that are not socially approved of. There are a lot of things that are not socially approved of that are good, and perhaps not even that skirt the bounds of how a lot of society might view them. So, for instance, savings. The government likes, as far as I can tell, it likes having people's money in a place where it's a very tax non-advantaged, and people are constantly looking for tax advantaged places to put their money. And so Bitcoin kind of gives a pure form of that, where you can put your money away and you're not causing any tax issues because you're not trading. There's less need to trade. I suppose, if you're Warren Buffett and you hold on to things for a long time, you're also not trading those things. But people can go ahead and do that. We've also seen various issues with people getting deplatformed and debanked, and Bitcoin has been a way to get around those things in a way where, it's highly politically charged, and it's done in a way that, in many ways, like for what we see, it's sort of not illegal per se, and yet in a sense it's like de facto illegal because of just, well, why don't you start your own bank? Well, it's like Bitcoin lets you do that. And so there's certain things where people are able to continue to take care of their families and so on, despite the fact that they're doing things that have not been approved by, certain parties that happen to have a lot of control over things like payment processing or even just holding your money at a bank. So with that in mind, the things like the Silk Road, it's not that I condone these things, although there was actually a lot of good things being done on the Silk Road as well. My understanding is, for instance, selling Bibles, including to places that have strict rules concerning that. And it can help evoke those images of, I can still have a control of my life even in places that are not currently sanctioned by various groups. So it's almost like an anchoring issue of like, if you can see the craziest thing, it's much easier to figure out how Bitcoin might help in much less crazy, but no doubt important aspects of people's financial lives.
Yeah, I like that perspective. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I've heard kind of this similar argument on the governance level for Bitcoin for why the block size war in 2017 was very good, is because even if we don't want an increase in the block size limit and all the drama around that, it did prove out that Bitcoin's governance is decentralized, and that the block size limit can't just be unilaterally increased by the miners, and so the monetary policy can't be unilaterally changed. So I think that even in the negative events in Bitcoin's history, they always prove something very positive.
Yes. And so, I think a lesson for Bitcoiners, like you don't have to defend the market as a whole. We don't have to defend everything that's on the market, but instead think about the principles that maybe allowed certain things in the market to occur to see how they can actually work for the good of good people, for the things that we do like. And also just see that that's not like that the problem with drug dealers using Bitcoin is not the Bitcoin. It's if your problem is drug dealers, the problem is drug dealers, not the money they're spending. And for those who are against it, well, you got your way in the sense that the government was enforcing things. Now he's been pardoned since, and I'm very happy to see Ross out of prison. But so I guess now they could say that they didn't get what they wanted per se. But it also seems a little weird to use one guy as a scapegoat for an entire class of Bitcoin usage. So. A critique that I would also put at the sort of drug dealer type view of things, of people like, oh, Bitcoin's for all of these kinds of transactions that are otherwise, illegal and so on and so forth. One thing that I would critique them on as well is that, he says here, Bitcoin is subversive as more than just a payment processing technology. And I agree with that, depending on, specifically what it's subverting, central banking. And I would say that a lot of the sort of black market type talk of Bitcoin, whether it's terrorists, whether it's drug dealers, et cetera, various rings of nefarious actors, those are also like, it's basically like, okay, it's like a new payment processing technology for those people. And it's, so it's like, it still buys into the Bitcoin is payments, as opposed to Bitcoin is actually like a whole monetary technology, which is, based on savings and payments as a way to, settle between those actors. It once again like devolves into focusing on the payment technology. So I think that's kind of funny is there's a focus on this and not thinking about, well, how does this affect central banking and so on and so forth. And we've actually seen a lot of people in the Bitcoin world who have changed their habits regarding various substances because of the fact that Bitcoin offered them a savings technology, such that I've heard from many people that they actually purchased substances and drugs and such on the Silk Road. And so they had Bitcoin, but then they held on to their Bitcoin and they started to have the sense of where the price was going. And well, why am I spending my money on weed when I can save it? And those people now don't really participate in drugs anymore. And they've grown up, they have families, they have savings, and so on and so forth. So, you know, you can get mad about Bitcoin as empowering drug dealers, but you know, those same people that do that should also look to Bitcoin as a way to sort of, you know, get people clean. And you don't hear those skeptics talking about that side. And you know, I think that's unfortunate because for me, I think that those stories are much more inspiring.
Yeah, I agree.
Continuing on, the disconnect. These, quote, image problem people are like if the Clampetts discovered that they were sitting on a swamp made out of crude oil and worrying that people won't accept it because it's too ugly and gross. So they try to convince people that it's a pretty shiny pink and tastes like cherries. The only way to think Bitcoin has a bad image is by marketing it to the wrong people. Yes, just about everyone could benefit from Bitcoin right now, but for most people, the immediate benefit would be relatively small, and it is too much to ask them to understand both the economics and the cryptography that would be required to convince them that Bitcoin has a vastly greater potential than it has yet achieved. Instead of marketing Bitcoin to the people creative enough to see its potential, or to those who so desperately need it now that its benefits are obvious, entrepreneurs like Jeremy Allaire are attempting to market Bitcoin to the average American as a payment processing system. This is premature because Bitcoin's benefit as a payment system is only significant after lots of people already have it. Therefore, the benefit is marginal to most people. As Bitcoin improves, and particularly when it begins to weaken the fiat money system, more and more people will find it prudent to adopt it. Bitcoin inspires suspicion among bankers and regulators. Bitcoin has a bad image with them, but that's their problem, not Bitcoin's problem. Those who are worried about banks boycotting Bitcoin or the government regulating it out of existence should not plan to start a Bitcoin business under such regime uncertainty. Eventually, Bitcoin will have become so widespread that it will have drastically reduced the scope of both banks and government. Then that will be a good time for payment processing companies. This is all a bunch of narcissism. It's an emphasis on appearance without substance and respectability among people who don't matter. Bankers aren't Bitcoin owners yet, and until they are, their opinions are not important. If Jeremy Allaire thinks that Bitcoin has an image problem, he should try smuggling it into Argentina instead of marketing to Americans and bothering with American banks. So, yeah, once again, you know, it is interesting to see here the sort of mismatch between people who get in as entrepreneurs and the actual product market fit. So the fact that Bitcoin is growing, and it's growing because more people are holding it. And while there is a bit more payments and some level of desire for people to pay, that was a very common refrain at that time, as we talked about in the hoarding article. You know, the actual market fit has much more been as a savings technology. And but all the people who come in, I don't want to say all of them because it hasn't been all of them, but like a large number of people who come in, they immediately want to do entrepreneurial stuff that is not aligned with that product market fit.
Yeah, the other part I find interesting out of this is that what we saw with Operation Choke Point 2.0 is that the regulators were trying to stop the bankers from using Bitcoin, and the bankers wanted to use it to make money. So it really shows that, yeah, there are still some bankers who, you know, have suspicion about Bitcoin, but ultimately the profit incentive is greater than the reputational cost.
Yeah, I suppose you could say, part of the issue there is because there had been that previous, this sort of image problem, so to speak, where Bitcoin is treated as bad because X, Y, and Z. That has played a role in shaping government policy thus far. But as you were saying, this is typically coming from people who they already decided they don't like Bitcoin. And so, it was going to be hard to convince them otherwise anyway.
Yep.
I think just also something to note here is, it's interesting how, we were saying Bitcoin really is a very grassroots, organic, and we do have we have marketing. We have lots of people on Twitter and on various forms of social media and podcasts. We have people everywhere. They get into boomer television. You have people on, going on CNBC. We have CNBC hosts like Joe Kernan. Like, people are out there marketing Bitcoin all the time, but it's not done through a marketing department. And it's interesting. It's like all the people who kind of went with this, because if you say that Bitcoin has an image problem, there's this implicit idea that you have to get everyone else to go along with your idea. So it's like everyone must, like, Bitcoin or whatever else that you're saying has an image problem cannot succeed unless everyone goes along with my idea of it, which implies a sort of desire to control and be in charge, have like a highly centralized, marketing team under your command to shape every last thing. So you need the Ministry of Bitcoin Truth headed by you. And Bitcoin doesn't have that, but we do have a lot of organic stuff where we have marketers, we have designers, but they're all doing it at the margins for particular people, for particular needs, and so on and so forth. So it's very organic and very market driven. In a true sense. Whereas the people who actually do things like, okay, how can I shape the image? How do we put it out? You mentioned Ripple. It's all the crypto groups that tend to have like the real marketing departments where it's like, okay, we launched a coin and there's a foundation, and in that foundation we have a huge marketing budget and a marketing team and these incredible, web designers and stuff, and they're going to make all the stuff so that people can fall in line. And in Bitcoin, as far as the actual thing itself, there's nothing. In fact, we're watching at the time of this recording, many fights happening over, even how to think about the code base itself and who gets to manage these things and so on and so forth. I think it's sort of healthy debates to be having in a decentralized thing, but where you see where you're actually seeing the fruition of this kind of highly centralized view of marketing and shaping image is in crypto, which, as we've discussed many times, it's basically it's garbage. It's negative. It has negative impact on the sort of economy, in just the sense that it's late stage fiat games, and that's where we see the people coming in to do that kind of marketing. So, I actually love the fact that Bitcoin is truly decentralized in this way, and that things have to happen organically, even where you have, groups, you might have companies who do have in their personal budget a large marketing budget and department that works on producing content and such. And, some people get frustrated by that because they feel like, they have a general disdain for influencers and so on and so forth. But the thing that I would point out there is these are all, it's still ultimately decentralized in the sense that none of those companies get to dictate what Bitcoin is or what Bitcoin's image is according to their own thing. All they can do is promote their point of view. And if they have a lot of resources, obviously they're going to have a lot more ability to get their particular vision out. But there's no requirement for anyone else to go with that. which goes back to, if others are talking about, maybe they actually really do like, various black market uses of Bitcoin, and that's what they want to promote. Well, you're under no requirement to share their stuff. You can produce the materials that give off the image of Bitcoin that you want to have and share that with the people you think would go along. But yeah, I think it's wonderful just how decentralized Bitcoin's marketing and development is. And I'm glad that we don't have a marketing department and shaping the ultimate Bitcoin image.
I do find it funny, though, when the decentralized marketing department, Bitcoin, is like arguing with each other, people saying, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. It's like, come on, guys.
Let's do but also you can just do things.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
Somehow we have to, I think that's probably the better mindset to go with, is you can just do things. So if you don't like how others are doing it, that is an opportunity for you to put out a better message.
Yeah, because they'll be like, oh, why don't you go on a podcast and talk about this? And it's like, well, why don't you? Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, I think this last section will be a good jump off for talking more about that. How to improve Bitcoin's image. The best way to improve Bitcoin's image is simply to improve the Bitcoin economy. With every new service, the incentives for more people to join us grows. We should feel lucky that we are on such a wonderful secret. We should feel lucky that we are in on such a wonderful secret as Bitcoin. If people mistrust and misunderstand it now, then we should be happy if it gives us a little extra time, however brief, to buy more. Every time someone figures out how great Bitcoin really is, he makes Bitcoin even more great by joining in. Bitcoin is stronger than all its enemies put together. It is so strong that its image does not matter one bit. It is the 800-pound gorilla that can sleep where it pleases. It is only through timidity and by failing to see its own strength that it will bow to outside forces. And yeah, so we have a picture from the movie Little Miss Sunshine, where it kind of gives the end. So I don't know if I want to like spoilers, but anyone who has seen the movie will kind of get, everyone's dancing on stage and looking like a total goof and being okay with it. And, he has in the caption, when you're in an immortal distributed system that can't be controlled, you don't have to care what other people think. And I would caveat that. I do agree, but I would caveat you don't have to worry about pleasing everyone, is I think the thing, because in many ways it's like, Bitcoin does grow by more people adopting it, so it kind of actually does matter what people think ultimately, because you'd prefer them to think that Bitcoin is good. But if there's someone who's tripped up by one particular thing, that's not the end of Bitcoin, and you can know Bitcoin itself is going to continue just fine. And perhaps either you or someone else will figure out how to tap into that person's psyche to get over the little bump they're running into. But Bitcoin itself will be just fine. So, you were saying that, like, with the podcasts, like, why don't you do a podcast? First of all, I mean, someone like you do endless podcasts. You've become a podcast maximalist, as we've talked about on this show. But also there is a division of labor. So as far as Bitcoin marketing, the other thing to understand with Bitcoin's image is, like, we're dealing with 8 billion people. 8 billion people all have a different perspective on the world, and they're all going to have different uncertainties that they face, that Bitcoin is going to offer some marginal solution to in a different way. And so you actually need a lot of different marketing to people to help them see how they can improve their economic conditions. And so it's also like a bit unwieldy to try to make a singular image of what Bitcoin is to appeal to all people. And instead, you do need this decentralized marketing department that's all tapping into different temperaments, different interests, different actual conditions, different cultural backgrounds, and so on and so forth, to be able to reach all of those different people where they stand. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, I was just reflecting on the fact that I've heard quite a few people, tell me offline, and I've also seen it on X as well, of people saying Saifedean's book is really bad, and it's creating this it has this very distorted image of Bitcoin, and he points out that Keynes was morally bankrupt, dubious, maybe a pedophile, and that it's just it's terrible marketing for Bitcoin. And then the biggest buyer of Bitcoin, Mr. Saylor, and his company Strategy, and he's like, this book convinced me to buy $500 million worth of Bitcoin, and I'm going to write the foreword because Nassim Taleb went off the deep end. So it just goes to show that everybody's got an opinion about every piece of Bitcoin marketing, and to take those opinions with a massive grain of salt, because as you point out, you might not be persuaded by the Bitcoin standard, but clearly, given the fact that the book has sold, I think, millions of copies at this point.
Over 1 million copies, yes.
And been translated into so many different languages, it's maybe you're wrong. Maybe it's good marketing, and it's not good marketing for you personally because maybe you don't understand Bitcoin. People have it's you got to reconcile the data with your opinion, right? And the reality with your opinion. Now, granted, yeah, sure, maybe there's other big buyers of Bitcoin who did not read the Bitcoin standard. Instead, they listened to Noted, for example, and that's totally fine. That's great. Different media. So some people listen to podcasts, other people read books, others articles, others, I had to read the Bitcoin source code to really, it's okay, that's good. And then others, it's only through conversations, they talk with other people, which to me is very foreign because I don't have long-winded conversations, with one-on-one with people. But it's just, they need that personal touch, right? They can't somehow just sit down and read a book. And I have a bookshelf that's full of Bitcoin books at this point. So, and there's more coming out seemingly every day that have a slightly different angle or a completely different angle and are very persuasive to different people. And I find it amusing when I hear people have maximalist perspectives on what the correct orange pilling technique or book is, because clearly that's an area where there's a lot of different approaches.
Yes, it goes back to there's a concept in improv comedy of yes and versus no but. So when people start a scene and they have to work with one another to make a funny scene, you have to just kind of you roll with one another, and so whatever gets introduced, you just say yes and, because if you start with no but, I don't like that, you've shut that down, and now you've made it harder to work together, and you've created a discord where it's harder to even kind of build out the ideas. And ultimately, it's you don't want to have a crab bucket mentality. We are in a high growth environment, and there's a lot of ways to skin a cat. And, even where you might somewhat disagree, I could go grab my copy of the Bitcoin Standard right now, and I'm sure I could find many sentences where it's I disagree with that. I disagree with that. I think this could have been worded better, et cetera, et cetera. And I could do that. I could comb through it. I could probably even write a sort of scathing critique if I combed through it enough, just because it's this semantically doesn't align
uncharitable
perfectly. Yeah, exactly. And I generally have preferred to be more charitable towards those who share in the vision for Bitcoin as the new global monetary system and work with them, as long as they're, you want people who are acting in good faith. You want people who are not actively sort of sabotaging the Bitcoin message, which I think altcoins effectively do, because all of their marketing in some ways like ultimately hinges on saying Bitcoin isn't good enough. So it requires, basically it's almost like a performative contradiction in a sense, right? Like to be super pro Bitcoin, but also buy my altcoin. Because if Bitcoin was so great that you're that into it, why do you need that altcoin? So obviously there are things like that you don't want. But when people are just going out and sharing stuff, there's way more ways to just roll with one another. And there's also there's good ways to offer criticisms in a way that are not just completely shutting people down, and telling plebs that they're just 80 IQ people, as opposed to viewing other people as having different ideas, and where you disagree, perhaps there's something that you can teach them, perhaps there's something they can teach you, and you can work in a charitable manner to improve the knowledge rather than just shutting it down like that. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'll let you finish your thought there. Sorry.
Oh, I was going to launch into a different aspect of this. So if you have more on that specifically, please.
Well, I think you were going to launch into the same aspect that I was going to launch into.
Okay, well then I'll launch into it, which is, people get really mad, and we'll use our friend Saifedean as a thing. Although I used to get this more when I would talk about it more. But when you have people talking about Bitcoin and then talking about some other topic, and they say Bitcoin fixes this, so. For both Saifedean and I, talking about the health benefits of eating a lot of meat was and has been a very common topic in the Bitcoin world. And there's people who get really upset about that, because it's like, well, what does that have to do with Bitcoin, and so on and so forth. And yet, I can't tell you how many people I know that it's like they got into Bitcoin, and then because there were Bitcoiners talking about some other topic that piqued their interest, suddenly they find themselves getting much healthier, because they're thinking more about the kinds of food they eat, the kind of lifestyle they live, et cetera, in a way that's been very beneficial to their health. And likewise, there's a lot of people I've talked to who they actually got into, say, carnivore diet type stuff, and they found so many of those people overlapping with the Bitcoin that it led them to finding out about Bitcoin and the sort of same kind of questions that led them to thinking differently about diet or architecture or art or whatever it might be. The same questions that got them thinking about that in an out of the box manner. So in some sense, once again, it's like, it's not illegal to have an opinion on art, but there are, different opinions that are highly unpopular. When you find yourself with the freedom to just engage with unpopular ideas, and that ability to think critically about these things, that same thing leads to questioning. It's like, okay, how should the money system work? What kind of money should I be saving? Should I be saving, et cetera, et cetera? All of these things play onto each other. And I think that's a wonderful thing, because people should be engaged with great ideas. Now, I think there's false ways. I don't think that you should say you're not a Bitcoiner unless you have my exact taste in art. I think that would be a mistaken view. But you shouldn't get mad if Bitcoiners have an interest in art and want to talk about art, and further talk about how money actually does affect the incentives of, art production, or how architecture has done because of both, maybe it's ideological, maybe it's the building materials, maybe it's zoning regulations, and how all of this ties into a fiat economy. Bitcoin fixes this, for instance, like just in general, has been a meme that drives people crazy. And yet I think it's so powerful because of this decentralized marketing effort, which is when you say Bitcoin fixes this, you can apply it everywhere because money is everywhere. Money touches everything. And so it's also a way to hook people in where they are. So I've talked to ranchers before, I do like my meat and I want high quality meat, which requires high quality ranching. So I've discussed Bitcoin with ranchers before, and I've had success. I'm able to talk to them about how regenerative agriculture works and the principles of it that make it succeed so well. And I'm able to first of all, explain how a degrading money, a debased money, makes it harder to engage in those principles because of the costs of inputs, the cost of land, and so on and so forth, the increased debt burden. I've been able to discuss that with them, but I've also been able to, so that shows how for their specific needs, we're unable to do what we used to do, and a better money system would help. And on top of that, I'm able to use Bitcoin or their ideas about regenerative agriculture as a way to metaphorically describe the sort of same principles that make Bitcoin a sustainable means of economic matters as opposed to just agricultural matters. And so you can take that same thing and whatever industry someone is in, whatever their job is, whatever their interests are, there's a way that money has affected it. And likely fiat money has degraded it in some way, or at least degraded it relative to what it could have been if fiat money didn't exist. And that by nature is a place that a sound money would improve things. And so it's a great way to get them hooked into Bitcoin and see how Bitcoin fits into their lives specifically. And I think it's an absolutely tremendous marketing meme that should be wielded. Now, once again, wield it with care. You don't want to say things that are untrue. But we don't have to pretend like money doesn't affect these things. And we should use that to our advantage at helping people see how they can improve their industries, their interests, their economic conditions with Bitcoin.
I agree. And you went in a different direction than I was going to go into. Then that's totally fine. I was going to go into what we were discussing before we hit record, which was that since this article was written, now we have the diametric opposite objection. We can't have BlackRock marketing that this Bitcoin is a great digital gold, when really what it should be is black market money, and that we have lost our way and Bitcoin is being co-opted by Wall Street, and now it's fiat. It's just fiat now, and so that's how far we've come in the past 10 years is we've really gone full circle on this argument.
Yes, I'd like to butt in and say, there might be some Bitcoiners who are listening to this, and they actually do have various misgivings of certain entities entering and how they feel about the particular marketing and actions and so on and so forth. And I want to point out that we're not even necessarily talking about you, like the sort of in group. There's this issue, the same out group of, various journalists, academics, people in the media, and so on and so forth, politicians, the same kind that would have said, oh, this is just for drug dealing back then. It's those people who are now saying the same tune of, well, now Bitcoin isn't actually Bitcoin. It was supposed to be this thing that allowed, the thing that I don't like, but now it doesn't offer that anymore. So it's failed. So I just want to point out that I do think that people within Bitcoin should maybe think a little different if they, depending on what their misgivings are. There might be ways in which perhaps you're not seeing things the same way that I think would be more clarifying. But more importantly, it's this outgroup. There's no winning with them.
Yeah. So I was listening to a podcast from the University of Chicago, and it had Eugene Fama on, and it had two of the podcast hosts. It was called Capital Isn't, instead of capitalism, because it's very clever. And they were talking about, oh, aren't these Bitcoiners so hypocritical? Because for years they were saying that they were separating money from the state, and now they're begging Donald Trump for a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And so, clearly they were just here to pump their bags, and they don't have any principles, and they were supposed to be libertarians, who, by the way, they don't like libertarians. It's like, to your point, it's like the out group also has latched onto this as being some kind of one shot, on Bitcoin or on Bitcoiners that we've lost our way. So what I'll say to all of that is that we have succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. Look, we didn't think this would happen, okay? And so furthermore, by the way, you can continue to use Bitcoin to buy drugs today. So it's not like that use case was removed from Bitcoin. It's still very much there. And there's still people who complain about that, and that, there's still lots of criminal activity there. I just saw this morning, Coinbase had some of its data extracted by malicious employees, I suppose, that then put out a ransom, $20 million, in Bitcoin, right? So ransomware still exists, criminal use of Bitcoin still exists, and strategic Bitcoin reserve and BlackRock ETF, right? So the idea that like one comes at the expense of the other, I think is profoundly misguided. You can have black market money and also have institutional adoption of Bitcoin. And anybody arguing against that idea is arguing against the actual reality of the real world today. So, it's not like it's not a theoretical argument anymore. We're talking about things that are happening at the same time today. And the reason why these things are happening at the same time today is because Bitcoin is permissionless, right? So it's neutral money for enemies. And so there's no way for one faction to exclude the other faction from their use case.
Right. And, of course, it almost feels trite at this point to say, but it always bears repeating that if you feel that way about, Bitcoin's bad because it has all of those different things going on, well, then you need to feel the same way about the dollar. But if you feel the same way about the dollar, it's like, well, what do you suggest the fix is? And it's like you have basically two options. One is continue building a completely totalitarian financial surveillance state that controls every last, penny, or just recognize that this is how the world works. And allow people to use the monies that work for them, in which case you should be asking, well, why do these people use the money that they use? So why is it that BlackRock wants Bitcoin? And you could say, you could have various ideas on that. And it could even be cynical as, they just want to make money. But then you have to ask is like, well, why is there a money making opportunity in the first place? Because they don't seem, they wouldn't be doing this if they thought there was a money making opportunity for a single quarter. They seem to think that there's a money making opportunity for a long time to come. So you should be talking about that as opposed to just, how did it manage to get to this place at all? Considering, you say this is beyond our wildest dreams. In some ways, it's just like, we did say that it was going to be the global reserve currency. So this was a sort of a natural part of that per se. But like at the same time, those other people, they thought Bitcoin was dead in the cradle. Bitcoin goes from, $30 to under $1 and it's dead in 2011. Those same people would have said, see, this is the end. This thing is stupid. So those people, it's quite bold of them to talk about Bitcoin failing like this after over a decade of talking about how it's already a failure.
Yeah, that's right. And you also hear like convoluted theories about how like BlackRock is going to use their Bitcoin to fork Bitcoin and, like just endless kinds of conspiracy theorizing, which it's like completely, to me, it's like, okay, that person is not particularly confident about Bitcoin's architecture from a governance perspective, that they think that that's feasible or plausible. And that, to your point, the bigger critique would be they're just using it to make money, right? Which is like, that's what you would expect BlackRock to do in any circumstances, that they're just trying to make money, because then that's, they're a for-profit corporation. And that if you think that's bad, then you just don't believe in Adam Smith's invisible hand or in free markets. So there's that part of it. And then there's the other part where people say, if you're not using Bitcoin for all of its properties of being censorship resistant, then you might as well not be using Bitcoin. You might as well just go back to using fiat, because you don't actually need Bitcoin's properties. And that part, I think, is just, it's almost a bee catcher argument of they're only thinking about the fact that transactions in the fiat system get censored. They're not thinking about the fact that savings in the fiat system get censored, right? So that's what inflation's all about. It is censorship of savings. And that's what the melting ice cube is all about. You can't hold dollars because your savings are being censored through the dilution of the money supply. And to deny that and say, well, look, that doesn't matter, blah, 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 I think that's just pretzel logic.
Yeah, well, this is what I was getting at. With people were always looking for tax advantage ways to get around things, and Bitcoin comes in like on a white horse and everything, because you could just put it away, and if you just had cash in a sound economy, it'd go up a little bit, but especially in this like high growth environment, you can just hold on to Bitcoin and you don't even have to think about investing in other things to kind of get an edge or anything. It's like you're already beating the market in the long run. So you don't even have to consider as like, oh, well, what kind of account should this be in? Now, like there's perhaps reasons for people to have, IRAs and stuff like that in Bitcoin. But if you just buy and hold Bitcoin without getting into those, like you might have capital gains taxes at the end, but that's at the end, like a long time from now. And meanwhile, you don't have to do anything with it to beat the market. Whereas if you just started buying equities outside of the a retirement vehicle or something, you're going to be trading, you're going to be having to deal with capital gains and losses, just dealing with all the tax burden of that, which is part of the benefit of using one of those retirement accounts, is being able to trade. But Bitcoin just offers this very simple solution but at the core of it, it's because it doesn't get diluted, it does not get debased, and so you don't have to worry about all of those things and staying ahead of inflation and all of the games needed to do that, where all of that. So, and people, it's like you have to pay taxes when you earn your money. You have to pay taxes when you spend your money with sales taxes. You have to, you just have taxes. And Bitcoin is this one place where you can not only let it just sit and not be incurring additional taxes, which is direct taking of your money. It's also inflation proof, and it just flat out beats the market. So you don't have it being, the value is not debasing, it's actually increasing over time. And that's just incredible. So it's like, like of all of its properties, as far as like what I actually deal with on a day-to-day basis, are there things that the government is doing that has various effects on my life? Yes. And, we could write, many volumes on that topic. But in terms of like real day-to-day living, the things that get me are effectively the price tags at the grocery store. And with Bitcoin, you have more protection against that, and the sort of, like you're saying, the censorship of savings, so to speak, with all of the ways that your wealth is chipped away at by the government. Bitcoin protects against that. And that can't be understated. And that's something that every person has to deal with. And so if we want to talk about the censorship resistant usage, it's like that actually is like the highest use for me.
Well, I think to your point, I think another really great use is purchasing Bibles on the Silk Road. But I've found here in Texas that there's a lot of different stores that'll sell you Bibles over the counter.
Right. Yeah, I'm saying that as someone in Texas.
I'm joking.
Yeah, well, but even then, there's like a question of, well, if you can figure out if those people have access to the internet, is there like a simpler way that you can dematerialize things so they can get access to that kind of information without needing to go through that cumbersome thing, and then it's free, and you don't have to spend any sats to get that. So yeah, I think. Yeah, I certainly don't deal with that kind of issue here in Texas, thankfully. But I think it's interesting that over time, this image problem has never gone away. People still get up in arms about drug dealing, about terrorism, even though a lot of it ends up being lies. And even the chain analysis companies will point out in their reports that the sort of illicit activity is way lower than most people think. But there is obviously like some level of activity happening, like you're saying with ransomware and paying people off and bribing them to do illegal and questionable things. But Bitcoin marches on, and so these things continue, but it clearly has not affected. And meanwhile, the fact that they're now upset because Bitcoin is getting into BlackRock and other like major financial institutions, like in a really astoundingly big way, that only goes to show it's just like it continues marching on. And ultimately, these things just have not affected the image as much as the price itself and the sort of market itself, demonstrating Bitcoin's capacity to deliver as a sound money. And all of those other things, insofar as they do happen, are themselves downstream of the fact that being a sound money allowed those things to occur even when we don't like them. And we should view that as maybe cause to understand even more how it's benefited us in being able to do our licit activity with Bitcoin.
Yeah, it does feel a little bit borderline unethical to buy a Bible using fiat. I'll be honest. Yeah.
All right,
I won't go the whole way and say, it's immoral, it's a sin, but it's pretty borderline. Consult your spiritual advisor.
I think it was in, I'm trying to remember, it may have been in Money, Bank Credit, and Economic Cycles. There was a quote from an old, I think it was a Spanish scholastic, saying that if you're using a money that is being debased, so basically it's like if you are doing your banking with a bank engages in fractional reserves, that it's likely at least a venial sin. So yeah, that's probably a topic for a totally different day. But there might very well be arguments as to why I think engaging with fiat is in some ways unavoidable. Even the people who are quote on zero tend to use credit cards, and so it doesn't seem completely avoidable, but there very well might be ways in which dealing with fiat is borderline, if not like outright unethical. And Bitcoin then actually has a fantastic image because it is a way to avoid those things and not have to participate where we don't want to. And that should also, I actually do think that fits in here to some degree because of what I was saying earlier about, people who used Bitcoin to wean themselves off drugs. There's always these positive sides as well that we have to consider. So you're saying Bitcoin allows people to engage in drug trades. Well, I don't know what circle of hell Dante would put drug dealers, but I'm pretty sure users and such are in a much, much deeper circle of hell. So, instead of focusing on where that is allowed, how about celebrating the fact that I can avoid participating in that system as much as possible because I have access to Bitcoin? And so to me, that is an extremely positive image for Bitcoin. And it's one that we should celebrate instead of it may allow various forms of illicit behavior, but I would argue that it allows even more amounts of good, licit, ethical behavior.
Yep, that's right. Good place to close it out if you'd like.
Yeah. So, thank you for joining me. And Bitcoin has no image problem. Bitcoin is awesome. So thank you for joining me, and thank you for listening to The Reorg. This podcast is brought to you by the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute, dedicated to advancing and preserving Bitcoin knowledge. Our mission is to deepen understanding and appreciation of Bitcoin, not just for today, but for generations to come, by creating enduring educational resources and generational knowledge for generational wealth. If you enjoyed the show, please support our work by sharing links, deepening your own Bitcoin knowledge by exploring and studying the SNI archives, and contributing sats. As a 501c3 nonprofit, we rely entirely on supporters like you. Whether you can give a few Satoshis or a few thousand Bitcoins, your contributions enable us to continue educating current and future Bitcoiners worldwide.